Hello all, and welcome to Laude's session on industry consolidation. Appreciate everybody being here. Thanks for getting up so early to folks who actually put this on, and for those of us who are on the East Coast, thanks for taking time after lunch to be here. So my name is Joe Paduta. I am the moderator of this panel, and we are joined by two esteemed folks who I will introduce in just a moment. Unfortunately, Dawn Watkins with the LA Unified School District was not able to join us. Something came up in her real job, which took precedence over this. I know, shockingly, something else could be more important as well. So this is going to be a pretty freewheeling discussion. I'm going to start by asking a couple of different questions, and then ask one of the panel to sort of weigh in, and then there will be a discussion back and forth. And I'm also going to attempt to, and please remind me if I don't, summarize the sort of takeaways from each question, so we can cover those in advance. I really want to thank WorkComp Central and Yvonne Guibert, specifically Yvonne and I have been good friends, at least I would say we're good friends, maybe she would not, for probably 25, 30 years, and just great to see her in a leadership role at the WorkComp Central, and congratulations to Yvonne, and thanks to the staff for putting this together, and everybody at WorkComp Central. We had asked that we're going to have sort of two different parts of this, and just ask that you hold questions until the end of each of these sessions. So the topic on this is how consolidation impacts industry stakeholders. And the two folks who are going to be helping us understand this are Alex Swedlow and Russ Pass. Alex is also a good friend. That's my characterization. I'll let him modify that as necessary. He's got more than 25 years experience, probably several more than 25 years experience in health services research, health policy, public policy analysis, and has published dozens, if not hundreds, of research studies. In 2013, he was named president of the California WorkComp Institute, and after having served for the previous 13 years as executive vice president of research. He'd been a consultant at CWCI before then, and worked on a lot of stuff to enhance data collection and research on a variety of topics in the workers' compensation space. He's got quite a lot of experience in a whole broad area of matters related to workers' comp and employment. He's also worked in the payer industry as well, so he's got that background. Alex got his master's degree in strategic planning and health services research from GWU, George Washington University, and was awarded their International Research Fellowship Award. And as anybody who's been in this business for more than 5 seconds knows, Alex is the most sought after speaker in this entire industry. However, that's just because people don't know Russ Pass as well as they're going to. Russ will vie with Alex for that esteemed position of
he will try.
Russ, I will cede all invitations to you happily.
So Russ is Executive Vice President and Chief Information Officer at Gallagher Bassett, and he's got responsibility for strategic planning, product development, information technology, and GV's Innovation Lab, which has come up with some really interesting research on the impact of evidence-based clinical guidelines, provider practice pattern analysis, and really digging into the whole network issue. So Russ has got a lot of excellent background in that. He's been with GV for 10 years. Before that, Russ was a founder and a partner with Bridge Strategy Group, which was a management consultancy focused on the insurance industry. He started with Anderson, which, again, for those of us who've been around a while, is now called Accenture, but Anderson Consulting. And he was a principal there and had a number of positions in both the consulting and the research and development areas there. He has his BA from Northwestern University with expertise in mathematics and computer science. So hopefully I got both of those right. If not, we can correct them in the liner notes later on when the album comes out. So with that, let's go.
What about you, Joe?
Oh, I'm Joe Paduta. I am just here I'm principal of Health Strategy Associates, a consultancy primarily focused in the workers' comp medical management space. I also do quite a bit of work on the pharmacy side in workers' compensation, and do a good bit of speaking and write a blog on this, which manages to delight and antagonize people on an ongoing basis. So that's my goal in life. Was that adequate?
That was terrific.
Oh, I aspire to adequacy, so thank you for that. So jumping into this, there are really two types of consolidation that have impacted industry stakeholders, and I want to specifically thank Alex for making me think differently than I was before. I was thinking of this in terms of industry consolidation being, typical mature industry consolidation, which I'll get into in a second. But really, what Alex brought to the fore was that there's been a consolidation of medical policy, medical management regulations, all things medical, and regulatory authority. So that consolidation of those two areas has really had a significant effect that we're going to jump into in the second half of our discussion today. We're going to start off with the sort of stakeholder consolidation. Workers' comp is an extremely mature business. It's been around for well over 100 years, and basically we've dealt with the same type of injuries humans have had for the last quarter millennia, or even more, 250,000 years. And that are basically musculoskeletal conditions. And like all mature industries, it is consolidating. The big are getting bigger. There are some startups underneath, but the number of service providers, TPAs, carriers, et cetera, is shrinking. It is not growing. So the question is, what is the impact of this consolidation in the workers' comp industry for workers, for employers, and for other stakeholders? Now, just a brief introduction to this in the work comp space. There's both this sort of horizontal consolidation where you have companies that are acquiring companies in adjacent spaces. So you might have like Mitchell, Gen-X, Coventry, and all the acquisitions made there. So Mitchell, Bill Review, acquired Gen-X, Bill Review, Case Management, et cetera. And then they also acquired Coventry and some other businesses in the mix. You have Paradigm is another example of that, that's acquired businesses in adjacent spaces. OneCall is another example. In the sort of vertical where they stay in their lane, if you will. Sedgwick is an example of an organization that's acquired other TPAs. ExamWorks has done a pretty extensive roll-up in the IME business. So with that sort of as background, obviously there's Exam is probably the biggest example of consolidation. They've consolidated a lot of that space. The first question is, and I'll start off with Russ on this. If you could describe just first off, is that consistent with your understanding in terms of consolidation, Russ? And just briefly summarize how it's affected Gallagher Bassett, your stakeholders, your customers, and your employees.
Well, I guess at the risk of offending the moderator out of the gate, if you don't mind, I would tweak your definitions just a little bit. I would say we would probably look at consolidation in three different forms. One would be amassing scale. So companies aggregating together, other companies that are essentially in the same business. Then there's a second form, which you alluded to, which is vertical integration, which is companies buying up suppliers or actually potentially customers as well. Then there's a third flavor, which is really more about packaging together adjacent businesses. So for instance, Sedgwick's acquisition of Cunningham Lindsey. Sedgwick didn't do a huge amount of loss adjusting prior to that. And its acquisition of Cunningham Lindsey didn't, or at least in my view, wouldn't be characterized as having reduced the competition in the work comp third-party administration space. So I think recognizing those three different types is important. And it's really that first type, the one that is really about amassing more scale, and which you already do, that has the potential to reduce competition. I'd say from our perspective, thinking first about or looking first at TPAs, most of the traditional third-party administrators are really pursuing very different strategies. There's aggregating, there's a strategy of trying to be the best in what you already do and focusing in that area. There's a strategy of trying to be a one-stop shop. So there are various strategies that are being pursued. All of the major third-party administrators, I think, still retain comp as a core offering. And so for stakeholders in the business, I think they have and will continue to have a number of different choices from a claims management perspective. Looking at service providers, some of those providers on whom we rely, there's been a lot of there's obviously been a lot of movement in a variety of different directions. There's been consolidation. I think there've also been over the years, quite a number of new entrants. Our perspective, I think our experience and that of our clients is that, again, it has not really reduced the amount of competition in this space. We still have a number of looking at medical bill review, which is probably the most visible. There's still quite a number of competitors that remain in the business. I think there's also the potential for companies to insource. So we have companies that are acquiring their suppliers, also companies that are insourcing things like nurse case management. And then nature has a tendency to abhor a competitive vacuum. And so we're aware of, and I think we've observed over the years, that there is a lot of opportunity for new entrants into fields that have become overly consolidated and where customers, clients feel that they don't have enough choice. That is, I think that's at least the perspective from our vantage point.
So just a quick follow-up with you, Russ. So if you could just identify sort of the negative implications of that mass consolidation, of that amassing, and I much appreciate your differentiating into three groups. I think that was very helpful. If you could just sort of list off a few of the negatives, if there are, and the positives as well. You did mention that there hasn't been a diminution of competition, which is very helpful.
Yep. Well, I would say there have been some positives, right? Putting together companies, especially in our business, actually, where the amount of data that you can amass in a world of AI, and I think this is going to be a consistent theme throughout our conversation, but the entity that has the most data has significant advantages in determining, what the best practices are, what works well and what works less well. So there are, and then integrating offerings. So for instance, as a claims management company, when we engage a nurse case manager, the tighter that engagement can be. So it's specific things that we see in a claim that lead us to believe that we should engage a nurse case manager on that claim, and the ability then to provide information on what we're seeing, direction on how we'd like that case handled, and so forth. There are clearly benefits, I would say, for the injured worker, for the employer in that. The disadvantages, and again, I would say for the most part, there are more potential disadvantages than real ones, because we haven't seen issues with pricing. We haven't seen an inability to find providers that provide a high quality of service for us, and by extension for our clients. So while there are potential disadvantages, I don't think, at least from our vantage point, we've experienced any real problems. I think perhaps the one thing is that to the extent that the players do change, that there's consolidation, there is disruption, and some of our providers, take Mitchell, Coventry, GenX. I think you've written about this, Joe, likely to be internally focused for a while. Mm-hmm. So a little bit less of their effort on innovation, a little bit more of their effort internally focused on integration, trying to make the most of that acquisition, hopefully for their customers, probably for their owners as well. So that internal focus is a negative, but it's a soft negative, not one that'll be easy to isolate.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Russ. Appreciate that. Alex, flip it over to you. There's obviously been a lot of impact of this out in California, some positive and potentially negative implications. What's your view on this?
Well, from our vantage point, one of the primary pieces of variation or consolidation can be seen by the number of players offering workers' compensation insurance in California. And if you create a timeline of the number of players, or perhaps focusing in on the top 5 of the largest carriers, or the size of the state fund, depending upon what era we are in workers' compensation's history, those percentages move quite a bit. And we'll talk about this a little bit later on when we get into medical management, but one of the more obvious changes that we have been watching over the years is depending upon the degree of managed care controls and one's ability to properly estimate the cost of medical care, there was a lot of entering and exiting of the system from carriers. It reached the high point of, I don't want to use the word chaos, but there was certainly a lot of churn during what we sometimes refer to as the Meniere era, which shifted the balance of control from any kind of balanced debate between the physician and the injured workers representatives and the insurer, who was in charge of managing the delivery of care. All that was fundamentally changed in the mid-90s from an in-bank decision from the courts, which basically said the primary treating physician is probably in the best state to recognize what is best for the injured worker. Let's get out of this whole dueling docs issue. Let's move past it, and just let's give the ball to the primary treating physician. That was a monumental decision. And between, I would say, 1992 and 2003, when that decision was finally laid to rest, the average cost of healthcare quadrupled. Right, it went from about $9,000 to about $36,000, and so it was almost impossible to know how much a particular claim was going to cost. This is the long way around saying it was that inability to really understand where the money was going to go that caused some 28 different insurance carriers becoming insolvent and leaving the system. That ballooned the size of the state fund to a point where there were about 40% of the market in the early 2000s. And this was an organization that had a historic share of about 15% over a 25-year period. So you had a lot of exiting and entering of companies and a state fund that grew to a size that was really just unnatural for them. There was a lot of turmoil, a lot of confusion, and just poor performance across the board. I think the combined ratios at that point had reached, about 190. So no one was doing particularly well at that point. That was when we sort of began to see the value of consolidating all that variability. And the consolidation could occur through public policy. I don't know, we can get into this a little bit later, but it was probably one of the most important decisions was to move from that presumption of correctness on the primary treating physician to an objective outside standard of care that we would all agree to as having the best guidelines for what is and what is not appropriate treatment. So what we often refer to as the skew, that small portion of the distribution that can really wreak havoc on the entire system. I think what policy has shown over the years is that it can really change the behavior of that skew and give us a more uniform, more consistent product.
Very helpful, Alex. So a couple of follow-up questions. So I think you've sort of identified this in talking about Meniere and subsequent to that. Given what happened there, how can we, and this is an Alex question, when we think about consolidation, it's going to be both, but start with Alex. How can we ensure that the needs of the injured worker, and then I guess secondarily their employer / taxpayer, are met in this consolidating industry?
Yeah, and that really is what should be first and foremost. How can public policy influence a better delivery system on behalf of the injured worker? And I think those of us who are studying all the dysfunction in the 90s and early 2000s recognize that there was a lot of truth to the axiom, random inputs get you random outputs. There were some claims that would routinely get hundreds upon hundreds of visits of physical medicine, or surgical interventions, spine surgeries, where there was no supporting evidence that this was a good idea or that this was a good patient for that. So that the creation of standards of moving from what was in effect 110,000 different standards of care, one for every physician in California, to one standard of care, an objective series of guidelines created and implemented and administered by the American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine, ACOM. That radically changed the discussion about what is and what is not treatment. It also hemmed in some of the most disruptive providers in the system that would routinely provide services that were, by any guideline standards, inappropriate. So in doing so, we created a more even environment, not an absolute one. This was not some kind of absolute rule of every patient with this condition will just get these services. There was a lot of play, but it did a remarkable job in pulling in the tail of the worst examples. A quick note on that one. We've talked ad nauseum about the opioid epidemic, and California has done a pretty good job in curbing that opioid epidemic. One of the shots across the bow that when we realized this really was an area that was crying out for policy, was we did a study about 12, 13 years ago that found that if you just look at all the providers who were distributing opioids, the top 3% were generating 2/3 of all the opioids in our system, and that there was no real fundamental difference in the kind of patients they were seeing than the ones that were not prescribing opioids excessively. So that was a real proof statement that these drugs were not being dispensed on objective clinical rationale. They were being dispensed for other reasons, including, business opportunities. So this was a case where policy consolidated a lot of that variation, and very successfully, because with excess opioids, you kind of lose control of the claim. So lots of beneficial things occurred just from that simple policy tweak of implementing guidelines, implementing more controls, and putting a white-hot light on inappropriate behavior.
That's very helpful. Thanks. Russ, over to you. You've seen this consolidation. As you mentioned, there's been some significant potential benefits to it and not a lot of negatives. How can we ensure going forward that the industry consolidation is going to continue to, continue the current level of protecting injured workers and employers, or ideally improve that?
Yeah. Well, I guess as a believer in free markets and competition, I think that's going to be key. I think part of it is being an informed customer, client, from whatever your vantage point is. So keeping an eye on the ball and knowing what matters most to you, because I think we can get very technical very quickly in this business sometimes. Mm-hmm. But if we really sit back and ask ourselves, well, what do we care most about? It's, I want a healthy workforce. I want as few injuries as possible. We want, when an injury does occur, to get our workers as healthy as we can, as quickly as we can, and then back on the job and motivated to the extent humanly possible. So one question is, how much of, it's very possible to measure and track those things, and how much of our time do we actually spend focused on the things that matter the most versus administration or price negotiations and things of that sort. So to me, what we need to know what matters to us. We need to know how we're going to measure it, relatively straightforward. And then from the partners, the providers that we work with, we need good information. We need tools to analyze that information. And then what we want to be seeing around these things, around injury frequency, around disability duration. We want to be seeing favorable trends. And then when we think about, which providers we want to be working with, we want to be able to compare performance across providers on an apples to apples basis. And I think, that's where entities like Alex's CWCI, WCRI, Work Comp Research Institute can play a really critical role. And then if we find that for whatever reason, things are not working with our existing providers, the easy answer is to switch providers, and a more complex answer is right up front to establish our arrangements in such a way that it's relatively easy to switch providers. I think for a lot of clients, for a lot of players, stakeholders in our business, the need to move data from one provider to another can be a real barrier. So establishing standards around how data is captured, how it's moved, and then pressuring our providers to be good, to make a priority of being able to exchange data, not just inbound, but also outbound if that becomes necessary.
Extremely helpful. I've got some that I'll share at the end of this. Last question on this area. So because you've got that there's more mass, I think, in a bunch of the different sectors here, whether it be, claims or medical management services, et cetera. Are there opportunities for startups and smaller companies, entities that are, or are there specific areas that are in need of more disruption than others? So I guess that's two things. One is, are there still opportunities for smaller companies? And if so, where are the niches that seem to make the most sense? And Alex, I'm going to ask you to sort of weigh in on this. Given your broad lens across everything you see out in California, you've got a wealth of access to data to sort of look at a bunch of different things that are helping in the industry. So what sort of strikes your eye as, hey, here's an opportunity that maybe the bigger entities aren't servicing as well as they might be?
I think Russ made a good point about consistency of how we collect and move data, but also the transparency of the availability of that data. It is amazing to me that about more than 30 years ago, in my first interview for a job in this industry, the guy who hired me said, "You know what my dream is? My dream is to have like a baseball card with relevant information on every provider in California. And like a baseball card, it would boil everything down to a couple of key numbers." Okay, we had that discussion some 35 years ago, and yet no one has cracked that code yet. Again, because of the immense difficulty of gathering all that information and distilling it down to the point where a civilian, even like myself, can understand. And I think until we have that kind of objective data, and there are people who would move heaven and earth to prevent that data from existing.
Yes.
It's going to be a tough slog, because if you do have adequate, easy to understand, objective data, people can make decisions. But the vacuum of where the inability to access that kind of data creates a lot of boundaries and confusion and opportunities to misbehave.
Certainly plenty of opportunities to misbehave, and the creative misbehaviors are great at finding those and driving a wedge in their physician dispensing opioids, drug testing, tens units. We are the poster child for a victim. Russ, anything? Sorry, go ahead.
Even something as basic as experience. We had done a study almost 20 years ago on a long-held notion in group health about what's referred to as the volume-based outcomes effect, or practice makes perfect. Wouldn't it be nice to know the level of experience that a provider has? This is another example of sort of consolidating around experience, right? We just don't have easy access to know that a given physician has done a particular procedure or handled a certain surgical intervention with enough frequency to have a lot of confidence. And yet there's a lot of evidence that it's maybe the most important variable you can ask your provider.
And one that is very dependent, again, on the ability to, because even the largest claims managers, let's say, are going to have a relatively limited amount of information on a given physician and that physician's experience with a particular type of injury at a particular type of severity. So again, finding industry utilities, the ability to aggregate that information so that we have a much clearer picture of who the top performers are, that 3% that you mentioned earlier, Alex, who they are, and at the earliest possible point, beginning to recognize the problem players and channeling employers, channeling injured workers to the highest performers.
So let me just briefly summarize what we've learned in this all too brief discussion of consolidation. More data is better, and it's sort of exponentially better the more data you have, just to key off something Russ was just getting into. Not a lot of negatives so far with consolidation. Pricing's been okay, quality seems okay. Most of these negatives seem to be potential negatives, but so far I haven't seen any evidence that that's been particularly problematic. The creation of standards that across the entire delivery of medical, the expectations there has been quite helpful, because to Alex's point, we went from 110,000 definitions of what should be to one, which is certainly an excellent outcome. And what Russ had really struck a note with me, where he said, what should you be doing? You got to be an informed customer. Keep it basic. My words, not yours, Russ. And measure the things that are important, and don't get caught up in worrying about things that don't matter as much, which is sometimes the price of the services. And I would wholeheartedly agree. I have clients who get all wrapped around the axle as this is 5% more expensive than this, and who cares? What matters is not what you're paying. What matters is what you're getting. And we need to, unfortunately, that's the easiest thing to do, is you can point at that, tell your boss that you cut savings or cut costs by 5%. Meanwhile, your medical spend went up 20%. But
yes,
that's different. So let's flip over to, and Alex had given some thoughts on this earlier about the regulatory policy thing. So where this regulations and medical policy is sort of consolidated, we see it in the MPNs, UR and IMR in California, Texas MCN, the adoption of the formulary that they did and announced it had great results, which I'm still highly skeptical about. Massachusetts UR, et cetera. And in some cases that intermingling, if you will, of regulations and medical has been positive, as Alex noted before, but in some cases, or some potential cases, it looks like it might have been a little bit less than that. So I want to turn to Alex for an introduction of the topic. And Alex, if you could opine specifically on the new or the potential legislation, the 1465, and how that seems to sort of unconsolidate, if you will, and therefore potentially take away some of the benefits that we've seen from those previous actions you described.
Sure. The piece of legislation that Joe was alluding to, Assembly Bill 1465, the idea behind that was we need to improve access to care, and who can argue with that? But we have to start with the realization, at least in our industry, that workers' compensation is about 1% of the California healthcare economy. And the other 99%, whether it's a federal program like Medicare or all the group health programs, they're wrestling with the same issue, and they haven't cracked it yet either. There are specific limitations that need to be addressed before any payer can have a serious impact on access to care. But the legislature decided that this is one method of how we can improve access, by creating not just a series of individual networks, but one granddaddy network, California NPN, which would start life as a consolidation of all the independent NPNs into one bucket, and then eventually, within a few years, grow to include any physician with a pulse that was still in the good graces of the medical associations. There were no sanctions or no inappropriate behavior, but if you had a license, you'd be in. And that runs against some 40 years worth of philosophy on how to build a network. Networks are typically designed around your catchment area, or your enrollees, or your policyholders, and you tend to tune those networks based on the requirements of those specific audiences. Throwing everyone into one big pot, first of all, from our data and from our analysis, would not do anything to improve access, because from our own analysis, time and proximity to treatment, whether it's an NPN doc or a non-NPN doc, is virtually the same. There's very, very little difference. Where there is a big difference is in the outcomes, in what kinds of treatment are selected, and the course of treatment and the ability to return someone to work, let alone the sensitivity of not only managing the medical, but managing the disability side as well. So the other implied piece of that piece of legislation would challenge the whole aspect of discounts and other network controls, such as dispute resolution. You start unscrewing those pieces that are traditional in networks and dispute resolution, and we are effectively back in that Manier period from the late 90s and early 2000s, where it becomes very difficult to challenge the opinion of that treating physician.
Life was so much better back in the Stone Age. Outside of random diseases and being killed by woolly mammoths, it was so much better. At least we didn't have to worry about internet access back in those days. So, Russ, flip it to you. So Alex was quite eloquent in talking about what happened in California that preceded it, and then now this seems like an attempt to sort of go back to the awful past. Are you, in your experience on a national, first off, in California, does that also concern you? Because you obviously have a huge amount of business out there. And then secondly, you've seen other things around the country where this sort of consolidation of regulatory and medical has been a good thing or has been a not good thing?
I guess from a public policy perspective, we've got the benefits and the downsides of the 50 state actually, with additional territories and all that system. So the downside obviously is a lot of inconsistency and fragmentation. The upside is there is a fair amount of opportunity for experimentation. So I think our view would be that I think things like fee schedules and formularies they have a role to play for sure. But how important is pricing and how important is discounting around the wrong procedures or a script that shouldn't have been written in the first place? And government tends to be sort of a blunt instrument for dealing with those kinds of questions. I think what has worked is government and I would say affiliated entities, industry utilities as information clearinghouses. And I think we always have to acknowledge that the whole work comp system is an enormous success story for which government has to be credited in a very significant way. Every year after year, somewhere between a 3 and 7% reduction in injury frequency occurs, largely as a result of the efforts of government. A lot of that has to do with tracking and reporting. Experience rating produces financial incentives for companies to create ever safer workplaces. We do have entities like CWCI and WCRI helping us to get the information we need to make good decisions. Another thing that works, I think, is a good economy. Low employment, a lot of competition for workers, and I think the work comp system and program of individual companies is an important part of the value proposition of a particular employer. I think to an earlier point that you made, Joe, one thing that doesn't work is too clear a division of labor between, I guess for lack of better terms, loss and loss adjustment expense. Those who are responsible for managing loss and those who are responsible for managing the adjustment process, whether it's in carriers or employers or any place else. Done well, loss adjustment expense is an investment in reducing losses. And you wouldn't want to be rewarding a reduction in loss adjustment expense if it occurs at the cost of much greater increases in losses. So again, I think government tends to be a blunt instrument. It tends to follow insight rather than lead, but it serves an extremely useful purpose in establishing standards, gathering, aggregating information, making that information available for research and study, and for people making decisions about, which companies to partner with, which practices to promote, and things of that sort.
So I've got some questions that came into the audience, and I apologize. We've got a ton of questions and 5 minutes left. So we want to handle these briefly, if you will. So let's start out with one from Bill Zachary. Bill says, Russ made a good point on the importance of injury prevention. Russ, has consolidation reduced the focus on injury prevention?
I don't believe so, because again, I think a lot of it's really the financial for the companies that's the main driver around injury prevention. And companies, I think it would be in everybody's best interest, and I'll keep this short. If companies were demanding more and better services from their providers focused on injury prevention, loss control, and maybe shifting the emphasis a little bit more in that direction from all the services that need to be provided once an injury has occurred.
Gotcha. Alex, to you, what do you think? Has consolidation helped reduce, or has consolidation reduced the focus on injury prevention or increased it?
I'm not sure that consolidation of organizations or vendors has essentially helped it. What I do think has helped it has been policy and transparency of outcomes. We know the general safety record of companies. You can look up their XMODs. You can get information from OSHA logs and et cetera to look at different industries. So, and just public policy of requiring workplace safety. I think those things are great examples of the value and power of both public policy when applied appropriately and the transparency of data to let civilians like us look at the track record.
And even if I can even go so far as to put that information in the hands of the workers, right? We're entering a period where, there is likely to be a prolonged shortage of workers in a growing economy, not just knowledge workers, but also workers in the traditional economy, in construction, in transportation, giving workers power, the ability to know easily, which of the prospective employers they're considering has the safest work environment. I think, again, when we focus on the interests and the needs of the worker and we give them information, they have the power to make decisions that make the whole system work better.
Question from Les Shute. Les says, I'm curious as to whether you believe consolidation has helped or hindered creative innovation in comp. So as we think about this consolidation, both from the regulatory medical and from the stakeholder, has that helped or hindered creative innovation? Russ, we'll start with you.
I guess my initial take is it's probably been neutral. I think, generally speaking, we do reward innovation. Our business here, we've got innovation awards from any number of different entities. Every company wants to be known as an innovator. I think we have startups, and I could mention a number of names, but we have startups, a lot of them in the AI space, that have innovative approaches that are helping us to deliver better outcomes for workers. And I think that most of the players in the system, I'd probably speak more for the TPAs as a group, most of us invest significantly. Not all of us, but we invest significantly in innovation focused on our particular strategies.
Great. Alex, what do you think? Helped or hindered creative innovation?
I think there's plenty of creativity in this industry. Whether or not it is proven to be of value, or whether or not there's an adequate track record to make a decision if it's valuable or a plus are two separate things. There have been a lot of promises in the past about different delivery systems would revolutionize medical delivery and speed recovery. I think one of our collective favorites, Joe, has been the whole debate over repackaged drugs and physician dispensed drugs. That was supposed to revolutionize things, and we all know how that one turned out. More recent developments involving artificial intelligence and blockchain, I think the jury's still out on that. We don't know what the overall influence has been. AI is particularly controversial. It's clearly beneficial in dealing with trying to deliver a more uniform decision-making process, but how it will influence the entire industry, it's a little early to grade that one.
Much appreciate that. So I apologize, gentlemen, but time marches on and we are restricted by the clock. So just a quick summary here. Innovation can flourish in this type of environment, or it can be suppressed. It comes back to, I think, what Russ mentioned earlier, which is you got to measure what's important and make sure that you're focused on that. I think Alex made some excellent points in terms of be very careful that things that we did over the last 30 years that we have made progress. Those of us who are old enough, been in the business long enough, understand where that came from. Folks who might be a little bit newer to the industry probably need to reflect back on why are the laws, the regulations the way they are, because there was probably a good reason for them. And let's not go back to something that could be dangerous. Finally, workplace safety, because of the easy availability of information published by a variety of different governmental entities, the information is valuable and accessible, but it's only valuable if you access it. So you got to get to it. And then workplace safety has gone up, and I think we've seen, as Russ mentioned, an ongoing decline in claims that's been going on for the last 30 years, and hopefully will continue. So with that, I'd like to again thank the folks, the professionals of WorkComp Central. Thank everybody who asked questions, and I will turn it back to the host. Thanks, everybody. Much appreciated.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.